Hey everyone, it's Blake. In today's video, I'm going to be going over traditional casing. So this is basically the how to write a traditional case video. I'll tell you up front, this video is probably going to be pretty short, and that's just because a lot of the parts of a traditional case have gotten their own video, and most of this is just going to be me pointing you towards those resources, but putting those ideas together. So without further ado, let's get into it. We're going to start with the affirmative. So parts of a traditional affirmative, there is framework, 2 to 3 contentions, and then sometimes an underview. So the framework basically answers the question, how do we evaluate impacts? I have a couple of videos on framework, but the constructing a framework video is going to be the most helpful here in telling you how to put together a framework for the purposes of a traditional AF. So I'll talk a little bit about framework, but most of the discussion is going to be focused on the contentions and the underview. So the contentions are basically self-contained subject areas that the AF improves. It's very similar to kind of an inverse of what is covered in the Intro to DA's video, uniqueness, link, impact, and all of that. But I'm going to go over uniqueness, link, impact here again, just because it's a little bit different when it comes to the AF side. And then the underview can be a lot of different things, so it's easiest to just talk about that in detail when we get there. So first, some quick remarks on framework. So the framework for a traditional case is pretty much going to be value criterion. So remember, value criterion framework, your value is an abstract good thing, most often something like morality. You'll occasionally see stuff like justice or equality. The criterion, also called the standard, is how we achieve the value. It most often takes the form of verbing a noun, something such as minimizing structural violence or maximizing well-being. And you need to provide a justification for both your value and your criterion. And the justification for the value can be as simple as the resolution has the word ought in it, so we should talk about morality. And the criterion normally has some cards to go with it and is more justified, but if you want more advice on how to construct a strategic or effective or well thought out framework, that constructing a framework video goes into a lot more detail. So now let's talk about the parts of an AF contention. So there's going to be 2 to 3 contentions in your typical traditional AF. And each of those contentions is going to focus on a single area and describe the impact that the AF has on that area. By going through this, basically telling this story of a uniqueness, link, impact. So the uniqueness is how the problem manifests now. The link is what does the AF do to reduce that problem, and the impact is why does this matter. So for instance, if the area that the contention focuses on is the economy, and the topic is nuclear power, the uniqueness would be the economy is struggling right now. The link would be implementing nuclear power increases job opportunities and grows the economy. And the impact would be growing the economy lifts people out of poverty and reduces suffering. So these are basically steps to tell a complete, coherent story and construct a clear argument when regarding a certain topic area. So to talk in a little bit more specific detail about each of these parts, uniqueness is a description of the status quo. It proves that not doing the AF leads to the impact. Uniqueness is really, really important. It's probably the most neglected of the 3 parts of a contention, but it's absolutely vital that you have it, because in the absence of uniqueness, there's no real reason why doing the AF is necessary, right? If you don't prove that a problem exists, then it doesn't matter that the AF solves it. Uniqueness may also make risk claims. So this is more common on the neg, like saying the economy is strong now, but it could collapse if this happens, right? But on the AF, occasionally you'll see risk claims as well, like climate change is manageable now, but is heading towards the point of no return or something like that. So that's the risk claim thing is more common for neg contentions, but you occasionally see it in AF contentions. It's worth mentioning. The link is basically what the AF does that impacts the area that the uniqueness is concerned with. So this is the topical part of the contention, the part that is specific to the action of the resolution. It connects or links the world described in the uniqueness and the world described in the impact. So how do we get from the problem that we currently have to the solution? And that has to do with the topic and the implementation of the topic. The impact is what is the result of the change described in the link. It's often an extreme scenario. So, in the economy example, the ultimate impact of economy might be preventing extinction because economic collapse leads to extinction, right? So these are normally really big extreme scenarios, but depending on your framework, so for instance, if I have a utilitarian framework, extinction or something like that is going to be very, very important. Whereas if I have a structural violence framing, I might want to articulate the impact more like the poverty example that I gave earlier. So the impact is basically why this whole change matters and is really important for setting up weighing under the framework. So now let's talk about the underview a little bit. So the underview comes in many different flavors. There's kind of three big categories that I like to use to explain underviews. Underviews are basically just a collection of cards or analytics at the end of a case that is basically, here's some other information that I want you to have. So it can either be topical, like preempting common neg arguments, like saying, alternative forms of renewable energy fail, or or like the economy is resilient now, so there's no econ disad. So it's specific to the topic area, hence me calling it a topical underview, but it kind of preempts common negative arguments on this topic. There's also the T/theory underview, which either preempts neg tier theory or sets up 1AR theory. So this is specific to debate and the rules of debate, right, and how debate ought to be constructed to be more fair and educational. So normally stuff that you'll see in a T-theory underview is stuff like the AF gets access to 1AR theory. 1AR theory comes before neg theory. Air neg on all topicality arguments. Stuff like that. And the last kind of big flavor of underviews is a K/method underview, which is basically a preempt specifically for common K arguments, and it most often takes the form of defending the methodology of the AF, such as the AF uses the government and state action is good or necessary. So generalized Ks that say like the government is bad would hypothetically not link if you have a good method underview. So these are optional. When you're starting out, you're not going to have an underview. You just don't need one when you're first starting out. But as you start to get into more progressive debate and advance your way from novice into varsity and all that kind of stuff, as you grow over your career, you'll eventually reach a point where adding an underview seems like a very good strategic option. So that kind of wraps up the traditional AF part of it. So remember, traditional AF is framework, 2 to 3 contentions, plus or minus an underview. A traditional neg is maybe a framework. We'll talk about that. And then 1 to 2 contentions. Because remember, the neg case should only take up 4 minutes of the NC because the other 3 minutes of the NC should be spent refuting the AF case. So we don't have as much time, so we don't do like 3 or 4 contentions on the neg. Typically 1 to 2 is pretty standard. So the reason I said framework is optional for the neg is because providing framework as the AF is obligatory, but the neg has the option to agree to framework and just argue that their impacts matter more under the affirmatives framework. So the negative debater does not have to read a framework every time. In fact, if the AF gets up and reads like structural violence and you are planning on reading structural violence as the neg, you should not read that framework because it's a waste of time. Instead, you should just start your speech with, I concede to structural violence as the framing mechanism. However, I would argue that negating is better for structural violence, contention 1. And jump straight into your contentions. So see the framework debate video for some strategic advice on like when it is necessary to read a counter framework versus when you just want to concede to the affirmatives framework. But if you do choose to read a framework on the neg side, it's essentially the same as the AF. It's a question of how we evaluate impacts, and the constructing a framework video will be very instructive on how to do that effectively. And then the 1 to 2 contentions are very, very similar to what we just talked about with the AF. They are self-contained subject areas, but instead of the AF improving those areas, the neg is going to argue that the AF worsens those areas. This is essentially identical to what is covered in the Intro to DisAds video, so if this explanation is too surface level or too fast, check out the Intro to DisAds for a little bit more of an in-depth explanation of what a traditional neg contention might look like, because DisAds really are just free-floating neg contentions in practice most often. So let's jump into the neg contention. So these are the exact same parts, uniqueness, link, impact, but there's a little bit of a different contextualization. So the uniqueness for a neg contention is most often why everything is okay now. The link is what the AF does or what an unforeseen effect of the AF might be, and the impact is why it matters. So the uniqueness is still a description of the status quo, but it proves that not doing the AF avoids the impact. It proves that the status quo is somewhat acceptable, right? So to use an example of, I don't know, what's a common topic area? I guess the environment. I'll use the environment example again. So the uniqueness, whereas the uniqueness for the AF would say something like, you know, we are reaching the point of no return for climate change and we need action now. The uniqueness for the neg, if the neg were to talk about the environment, would probably read something more like, climate change is manageable now, but if it continues to progress, it will become unmanageable. And that's where the risk claim side of things comes into play. So it's a little bit of a different articulation, but they're similar in effect in that they're both trying to describe the current status quo and why and how the AF would affect the status quo. It's just a question of the AF would argue that the affirmative positively affects the status quo, and the neg would argue that the affirmative negatively affects the status quo. Yeah, and then the link is basically what the AF does. It's the topical part of the contention. It connects or links the world described in the uniqueness and the world described in the impact. This is the exact same slide as the link for the AF contention. So basically, the link is just saying doing the affirmative makes the situation described in the uniqueness worse. And then the impact is why it matters. What is the result of the change described in the link? Often an extreme scenario, things like think extinction or, severe structural violence, discrimination, stuff like that. Depending on the framework, you're going to want your impact to be applicable to the framework. So if you conceded to a structural violence framing, you probably don't want to go all in on util extinction impacts, right? So make sure that the impacts that you're reading are contextual to the framework. So some final thoughts. Uniqueness is really important. It is kind of like the oft-forgotten part of case writing. But just like I said, if you don't prove that the status quo is acceptable or that a problem exists, then there's no reason why changing it would be concerning and or desirable. So uniqueness is really important. When you are just starting out writing a case, shoot for one card per part of a contention. So a uniqueness card, a link card, and impact card. Check out the video on how to cut a card to learn how to actually provide the evidence for each of these parts. As you get more experience researching and cutting cards, you'll occasionally find evidence that can pull double duty, like both describes the uniqueness and the link, or the link and the impact. But generally speaking, a contention, the safe way to write a contention is to have 3 cards, one for uniqueness, one for link, one for impact. That's the easiest way when you're starting out to make sure you're satisfying all of those requirements. See the Constructing a Framework video for more tips on framework and how to write strategic frameworks. And everybody should start with traditional casing before getting into the progressive stuff. Even if the progressive stuff is like the whole reason why you want to do LD because it's so appealing to you, start with traditional casing, get the basics of argumentation down, get your fundamental debate skills down, and then move on to the progressive stuff. So even if the traditional casing seems a little basic to you, I really, really strongly recommend that that's where you start before trying to jump into the deep end, so to say. So yeah, with that being said, I think that's all for this video. Hopefully this video in concert with the Constructing a Framework video and the how to cut a card video are sufficient to teach how to write a case from the ground up. Um, but if you have any questions, let me know or leave a comment or whatever. And otherwise, have a good rest of your day.